On December 11th, 1941, Adolf Hitler stood before the Reichstag and declared war on the United States. He did not need to do it. Germany was already fighting Britain. Its armies were stalled in front of Moscow. The war in the Atlantic was unresolved. And yet Hitler chose voluntarily to bring the world's largest industrial economy fully into the conflict. In hindsight, the decision looks almost incomprehensible. But it was not impulsive in the simple sense, and it was not the product of treaty obligation alone. It came from a pattern that had already shaped much of Nazi strategy: ideological certainty, repeated strategic gambling, and a growing inability inside Hitler's system to distinguish between risk that had paid off before and risk that had now become ruinous. The question is not whether declaring war on the United States was a disaster. It was. The question is why Hitler believed in December 1941 that it was still a risk worth taking. The usual explanation is straightforward. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th. Germany and Japan were both members of the Tripartite Pact. 4 days later, Hitler declared war on the United States in support of his ally. That explanation is tidy. It is also incomplete. The Tripartite Pact did not automatically require Germany to declare war if Japan started the conflict. It was framed primarily as a defensive agreement. Since Japan had struck first, Hitler was under no strict obligation to enter the war against the United States. That is the first point that matters. This was not a legal reflex. It was a political and strategic choice. And once that is clear, the real problem comes into focus. Why would Hitler make that choice at one of by late 1941, Hitler no longer regarded the United States as neutral in any serious sense? American industry was already supplying Britain on a massive scale. Lend-Lease was helping keep the British war effort alive. In the Atlantic, the Roosevelt administration had moved steadily closer to undeclared naval war, escorting convoys and deepening American involvement well before any formal declaration. From Berlin, this did not look like neutrality postponed. It looked like participation without legal clarity. Ed. But there is a difference between limited, undeclared confrontation and full-scale industrial war. Hitler either did not grasp that difference clearly enough or believed events would move too quickly for it to matter. That perception does not justify Hitler's decision, but it helps explain it. He believed that war with the United States was already developing in practice. The formal declaration, in his mind, may have looked less like opening a new conflict than acknowledging one that already exists. That was a profound mistake. Hitler's understanding of power was never purely strategic. It was ideological from the beginning. He consistently underestimated democratic states. He saw them as politically divided, morally weak, and incapable of sustained sacrifice. Britain, in his view, was led by a declining elite trying to preserve a fading empire. The United States looked even less impressive to him. Ethnically mixed, politically argumentative, commercially driven, and, in Nazi racial thinking, fundamentally soft. This was not simply prejudice sitting beside strategy. For Hitler, prejudice was strategy. And that meant he repeatedly judged enemy strength through a distorted lens. He did not ask only what his opponents could produce. He asked whether he believed their societies had the will, discipline, and coherence to turn that potential into military power. That framework had misled him before, but it had not yet punished him decisively. France had collapsed. Britain had survived, but not broken Germany. The Soviet Union seemed wounded. So the deeper lesson Hitler took from the war's first years was not that his assumptions were flawed. It was that they were being confirmed. The danger was obvious. A man who keeps surviving his own misjudgments begins to treat ideology as evidence. To understand the decision, it helps to strip away hindsight. By December 1941, Germany's position was serious, but not hopeless, in the minds of its leaders. The advance on Moscow had stalled, but the Nazi regime had not yet accepted that Operation Barbarossa had failed in its central objective. There was still a belief, or at least a hope, that the Soviet Union was nearing collapse and that one more major effort might break it. That illusion shaped everything. If Hitler had understood clearly in December 1941 that Germany was entering a prolonged war of attrition in the East, then declaring war on the United States would have looked even more self destructive than it already does. But he did not think he was choosing between limited strain and total overextension. He thought he was still operating within a narrowing but achievable path to victory. This point matters because dictators often make their worst decisions not when they think they are losing, but when they think success is still just one more gamble away. Hitler was not yet acting like a man who believed Germany was doomed. He was acting like a man who believed time was short, but history was still on his side. Japan's entry into war appeared at first to offer Germany major advantages. If the United States shifted its main attention to the Pacific, that might reduce immediate pressure in Europe. If Britain had to divert even more resources to Asia, its already stretched imperial system would weaken further. And there remained, at least in theory, the possibility that Japan might force the Soviet Union to worry about a second front in the East. That final possibility is easy to underrate now, but at the time it had real significance. German planners had long hoped Japan might pin down Soviet resources or even intervene directly against Siberia. If that happened while Germany renewed pressure in the west of the Soviet Union, the strategic consequences could be severe. But this was another example of Hitler confusing possibility with probability. Japan's priorities were not Germany's priorities. Tokyo was looking south, not north. It was going after the Pacific and Southeast Asia, not Siberia. The war Japan opened would indeed consume American energy, but it would also trigger the full mobilization of American industrial power. What looked in Berlin like a strategic diversion for the enemy became in reality the entry point for overwhelming new force. There was also a more immediate military argument behind the declaration. The undeclared naval struggle in the Atlantic had already created friction between Germany and the United States. Hitler may have concluded that formal war would remove remaining restraints on submarine operations and allow the Kriegsmarine to strike American shipping more aggressively before the United States had fully organized its defenses. In the short term, that logic produced some results. During the early months of 1942, German U-boats inflicted heavy losses along the American coast. The United States was slow to implement full defensive measures, and the submarine campaign briefly exposed real vulnerabilities. But tactical opportunity should not be confused with strategic advantage. Even at its most effective, the U-boat war could harass, disrupt, and impose costs. It could not reverse the deeper balance of power now forming against Germany. The Reich was no longer fighting one continental coalition and one maritime opponent. It was now opposed by Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States together. That combination made the war fundamentally different. No level of submarine success could alter that arithmetic for long. By the end of 1941, the problem was larger than one decision. The structure of the Nazi regime had become progressively worse at resisting Hitler's instincts. Earlier, Grand Bleus had strengthened him politically. The Rhineland had succeeded. Austria had succeeded. Czechoslovakia had succeeded. Even the war's opening phase seemed, for a time, to validate methods that looked reckless from the outside. This had consequences inside the system. When a leader repeatedly wins through risk, caution begins to sound like cowardice. Dissent becomes harder to sustain. Institutions stop acting as brakes and start acting as amplifier. Decision-making narrows around the assumptions of one man, and those assumptions grow more dangerous precisely because they have been rewarded before. That is part of what happened here. Declaring war on the United States was not some isolated break from an otherwise rational structure. It was the product of a regime that had spent years destroying the habits of restraint, skepticism, and institutional correction that might have prevented exactly this kind of overreach. The full consequences were not immediate. That is, one reason the decision can be misunderstood. Germany did not collapse in December 1941. The Eastern Front still dominated the war. America still had to mobilize. In the short term, it was still possible for German leaders to imagine that the conflict remained manageable. But long war strategy is not measured only by what happens in the next month. Once Hitler declared war on the United States, Germany was committed against an industrial coalition whose combined productive capacity dwarfed its own. The problem was not simply that America was powerful. It was that America entered a war in which Germany was already failing to defeat Britain quickly and already discovering that the Soviet Union would not collapse on schedule. This meant the Reich was moving into exactly the kind of prolonged, resource intensive, multi front conflict it was least equipped to win. The declaration did not single handedly lose the war. Germany had already made earlier decisions that had made victory increasingly unlikely, but it did help close off whatever narrow path remained. After December 1941, a German victory required not just battlefield success, but success at a scale and duration that the material balance made harder and harder to imagine. So, why did Hitler declare war on the United States? Not because he was forced to, not because he had carefully weighed Germany's long term chances and found them favorable, and not because America posed no real danger. He did it because he believed the United States was already an active enemy in all but name, because his ideology led him to underestimate democratic power, because he still thought the Soviet Union might collapse, because he expected Japan to disrupt the strategic balance, and because years of successful risk taking had taught him to interpret boldness as proof of insight. That is what makes the decision historically important. It was not merely reckless, it revealed a regime that had become unable to distinguish between a gamble and a plan. And by the time Hitler recognized what American entry into the war truly meant, Germany was already committed to a conflict it could no longer hope to control.